Good evening, folks. And tonight, I'm going to try to make this interesting, but not too long. This is the George Orwell quote from 1984. The very last one. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. Well, that quote seems to be actually pretty on spot. But let's get one thing straight about all this. Every statue that's Confederate is pretty much all a bad name. Now, let's go back in time. Why don't we? Let's do a little shout out to our adversaries called the Democrats, to certain Democrats, I shouldn't say all of them, but just to name a few. Cori Bush, you're one of them. To say the most disturbing things ever to say this land was stolen, first off, if this Revolutionary War never would have happened, we'd still be under British rule. This goes for everyone who likes her post. First off, if we were still under British rule, we would, and all of you who like sports that like that, we wouldn't have football. We wouldn't have American-made sports. We wouldn't have football. We wouldn't have basketball. We wouldn't have the rivalries we have today. You Democrats still don't get that, do you? Second of all, the British would have gone out westward and still would have gone out west. They still would have advanced westward. They still would have done more than what we would have done. They would have taken pretty much probably all of the United States. Every piece of land that there is today. They eventually would have probably taken the Dakotas. If they had their way. Unless the French would have somehow beaten them. But then again, the Mexican-American War. When that broke out, they had to take that part. That's an unknown thing. Several unknown facts here. The Louisiana Purchase, who knows that the French, if they would have fought over the French for that? Who knows that they would have taken that from the French? Who knows? But the Americans bought it from the French during the Revolutionary War. And so it went on. But to put all this into easy perspective, let's go back to the Revolutionary War, why don't we? The United States had one in particular plan. They wanted to make Canada a state. Canada would probably be one of the biggest states that we have, and probably be one of the largest electoral votes of all. Comment down below and tell me what you think. How many electoral votes they would be. California's the most we got, 55. It's been liberal since 88. Now, with that being said, this was some of their ideas of the Continental Congress's idea. This was Arnold's expedition. He went up through Maine, Fort Halifax, and a few other places. You have to look up Arnold's expedition to see it yourself. I didn't write it down, but it's you need expedition. Final destination, Quebec City, Canada, which is a highly French-speaking area. And obviously the French really hate the British. French-speaking Canadians love the Americans. They worship the Americans. They would do anything to get the British out of there. Well, in Quebec City, then there was Montreal area. The area of Montreal. Ethan Allen and him. First Ticonderoga was taken in 1775 by the Americans, by Benedict Arnold. Victory proposed there. Then they continued on Benedict Arnold's expedition up into Canada. So, they went into Canada. Part of the plan was achieved at Montreal by General Richard Montgomery. When Colonel Benedict Arnold made it all the way up there, he pretty much was successful. Pretty much went all the way up there, and pretty much took it all up there. Successful until they reached Quebec City. Disaster struck. Quebec City was a complete and total disaster for the Americans. They retreated back to the United States. Now, what would have happened if they would have taken Quebec City? They probably would have kept on moving into the United States. They probably would have kept on moving into Canada. Like they did. They would have moved all the way through Canada, taken other cities in Canada that were strongholds, and probably would have made Canada easily an American state. Most likely Quebec part, because that was all French mostly. Now, the other part was all British. Now, on to the other part. Now they retreat down southward, back into the Americas, and in New York. General John Burgoyne, from the British, had a plan to meet up with Sir Henry Clinton. Send a large British force to Albany with Sir Henry Clinton, where he would launch through Philadelphia and other areas that would crush the Americans. Almost happened. They were running right through them. Washington was in the area, except, lo and behold, the infamous Benedict Arnold at Saratoga, which was in the way. Got him. Broke that idea off and did stop John Burgoyne in his tracks. Literally, the entire force surrendered. Those that didn't die were forced to surrender. John Burgoyne was one of them. It was almost like the disastrous Battle of Camden, for the Americans literally had no battle left in them. They just literally got demolished down there in South Carolina. Just like Quebec City. A completely disaster. But Benedict Arnold literally told them how it was. He literally laid the law on them. But what does these quotes got to do with this war? It continues. The Americans won the war. Fast forward through this, the Americans ended up winning the war. Okay, next war. Several years later. After Texas got its independence from Mexico, Mexico says that's not correct. The war still goes on. Okay? So, lo and behold, war continues. So, 1846, a small little skirmish between England and the United States kind of erupts. No shots fired. It's like another Cold War. But not necessarily like a single shot's fired between the two. And the Oregon Territory. Up by like Washington and Oregon. Saying, because Canada is lined right there and everything. So they drew a line separating Canada from the United States. And that's where Canada and the United States were split. So they come back to the United States. Well, in 1859, a farmer, Farmer Griffith, who had pigs, his pig ran, swaddled over to, I can't remember the farmer's name. Excuse me, my brain's a little shot. And he shot him. But Griffith was angry. He said, "Pay me $10." The other farmer offered $10. And he denied him. No. He says no. Shortly before the Civil War, he says no. So he says this. 13 years earlier, prior to that, we'll talk about 13 years prior to that. Then he says, "I want 100. He says, "No, screw you. I'm not giving you $100. Forget it." So he asked the British government to bring in some troops. And then so the other guy brings in 50. Asks the American government to bring in some troops. Sure enough, we almost got a whole war going on. 66 of General Pickett's, yes, General Pickett, the same general who defected to the Confederates at the Battle of Gettysburg. That General Pickett, they famously known as Pickett's Charge. 66 troops were up there, with a total of 461 by the time all troops were finally there on the south of San Juan Island, known as San Juan Island. Well, they were up to like 2,100 some odd British troops up there. Both started harassing one another until someone would fire a shot. Nobody shot one person. Both London and Washington got a heard about it, and they said, "Stop! No one shoot anybody." Sure enough, more land was seceded to the United States. From Canada to the United States. Fast forward 13 years earlier, 1846, when that land was ceded there. Similar situation, except nobody shot one another. It was not even a pig. The only casualty in that war was the pig. It was called the Pig War. Weird how you call it that. And then you have that part right there, where the land was just seceded, handed right over to the Americans. Then you have the Mexican-American War, where they could not agree where the land was at. So then you have Arizona, and you have other land that was already handed over to Mexico. And sure enough, Mexico has a little skirmish at the Rio Grande River, which is where the state line was. And sure enough, war broke out. Or just a little shootout, a little small skirmish called the Thorn Affair. And sure enough, it happened. War broke out. Everyone's shooting at one another there, and then that caused another war to break out called the Mexican-American War. From 1846 to a certain date in 1848, the war finally ended. California, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, and parts of Nevada, and a few other states seceded from Mexico and officially became part of the United States. And then, Florida. Some people didn't want Texas. Democrats wanted Texas to become a part of the United States because it was a slave state. Sure enough, slave states. Whigs didn't want it to become slave state. Now, 1852 was when the Republicans were born. 1854 is when the Republicans were born. But Buchanan, who was in office in 1859, was just about ready to walk out of office when all this eruption occurred. But then along comes Abraham Lincoln, and lo and behold, guess what happens? The Civil War happens. And then you have these people from a lot of famous generals who were probably these captains, maybe lieutenants, even sergeants or privates, were fighting in the Mexican-American War for the Union. Like Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was for the Americans at that time, so was Stonewall Jackson and quite a few other lieutenants and probably even a few admirals. Brother against brother, captain. I mean, it was literally like that. It was literally shed into shed. And finally, the Civil War is done. We move on. Several years later, 1898, the Spanish-American War breaks out. All over fake news. Joseph Wheeler, a famous Confederate general who defected shortly after he got out of school, military school, the military academy. Maybe about, I think probably at least like 5 months after he got out of military academy, he defected. He reappeared back for the Americans. This time, he served for the Americans in the Spanish-American War. He really was a great general. Served for great purposes on both sides of the war. He was pretty much a hard-fought one. Now, when you look at certain things like that, the Boot Monument indicates Benedict Arnold made a decent charge. We'll talk about that one here in just a second. Then we go to World War I. Country's doing great. We fight back. We win World War I. World War II. 20-some years later, World War II. We enter World War II in 1941. And then we strike back. It's just weird how some of these wars start. And then the Korean War, then the Vietnam. And the World War II we'll be talking about, and World War I, we'll talk about that later. Same with Vietnam. But we lost Vietnam due to the way we did tactics. Tactics are all about how you win wars. Well, it is how it is. I mean, you gotta admit. But what does every one of these wars got to do with George Orwell's quote that I read earlier? Plain and simple. The Civil War, mostly, is what this has to do with. I get it. Every country has a bad past, like I said earlier. Every country has a bad past. But you gotta really shine every bad person's bad past with how they fight a war. Regardless which side they served on. My triple great grandpa served for the Union, and his brother was a Confederate. So I'm relative on both sides of the Civil War. So the point of this is, are we going to try to say that rewrite history? We're rewriting history currently as we speak. That's where the rewrite history comes into play. Trying to say that, hey, let's just forget about the way history was then try to rewrite history like the Civil War never happened. When the current Civil War is going on right now. Liberal against conservatives. Democrats against Republicans. Friends against friends, because that's technically what some of those are. Anarchy against friends. Pretty much, well. And then firefighters against police officers. I mean, that's literally what this has come down to. Socialist against capitalist. Communist against freedist. Authoritarians against egalitarians. Or I should say totalitarian against the egalitarianism. But with all that being said, it's an alright civil war between one another, even without a single bullet shooting at one another. And that's kind of like what the Cold War is. We're threatening to kill one another, but yet nothing's happened. Okay. Enough said. Let's take some action for a change, why don't we? Well, with that being said, I got some work I gotta do. So hit the like button, hit the bell for notifications. Like, subscribe. And with that being said, I'm out of here. Peace.